we'll have any chance of him changing his mind about closing our department." Ana sat on one of the upturned buckets and looked up gratefully as Georgie passed her a glass of iced water. "And I didn't mention it before, but we parted on bad terms, so that will probably give us even less chance of our jobs surviving." She turned to the large window which looked out over the water. The ocean was a sheet of silver with not a breath of breeze ruffling it. Half a dozen surfers waited for the waves on the point, and as she watched, a pod of dolphins frolicked around them. "Oh, wow! Look, that means good luck!" The magnificent view calmed her nerves a little as she sipped the cool water. She didn't want the twins to know she and Blake had been more than mere acquaintances when they'd lived in the share house at Toowong he'd owned 10 years ago. Even though they'd both been studying for a business degree, their philosophies had been very different. Blake's emphasis on conservative economics had been at odds with her study of welfare economics, and they'd eventually agreed to disagree when their arguments had become too heated. Their discussions had been stimulating, and Ana had loved sparring with him. Most evenings, she would bait him with a provocative comment about her day in class just to get a rise out of him. He was so passionate about his beliefs, he fell for it every time. She'd loved watching his eyes darken and his sexy mouth lift in a smile when he realized she was teasing him. She had instigated many a discussion just so she could watch his face come alive. And she'd fallen a little more in love with him the longer she stayed in the house. "We were absolute opposites in everything, and we fought like cats and dogs," Ana explained to her friends. "He even listened to classical music. I mean, who does that when you're young? That was my heavy metal stage, and it drove him crazy." "What else?" Sienna's beautifully made-up eyes were fixed on Anna's face. "Well, you know how I love football," she continued. "I used to go to the games at Suncorp with the other guys, and Blake would be off playing golf or something equally as snooty." Georgie giggled. "Are you sure you aren't being too hard on him? You did go through a pretty wild stage at uni." It all came to a head one night after we'd been to a State of Origin game. We came home and Blake was waiting on the porch, and he read me the riot act about the state of my room. God, even Mum didn't do that. Sienna picked up her paintbrush. Her eyes narrowed. "Maybe your mother should have?" "Thanks, sweets." Ana shook off the criticism like water off a duck's back. She was used to being teased by the girls. She'd lived in a mess at uni when she was busy studying and having a good time, and she still lived in chaos these days. There just wasn't enough time to run a business and finish restoring her old cottage. Keeping everything tidy didn't pay the bills. "So, what happened?" Georgie asked. Ana pulled a face. "I'd had a couple of beers at the game, so I told Blake he had no right to be in there, called him a sexist pig, and slammed the front door in his face. I locked him out of his own house." She smiled at the memory. "The other guys went to bed, and Blake sat outside, cooling his heels until I let him back in. Then I got the call from the hospital about Mum the very next day, and moved home. You know the rest." Actually, they didn't. They knew she'd given up in her final year to come home and nurse her mother through the final stages of breast cancer. But she'd never told anyone about that night with Blake. It was a delicious memory, one she'd pulled out and relived during the tough nights when her mother had been dying. When she'd decided to let him back in, Blake had been sitting on the front steps looking across the road at the muddy Brisbane River, and he'd ignored the open door behind him. Ana had stood quietly for a moment, drinking in the sight of him, before she'd called to him softly. "Blake, I've opened the door for you." His broad shoulders strained beneath his white polo shirt, and his dark hair curled over the collar.